The early 20th century was dominated by tragedy. The Titanic, World War I, the Spanish flu. Millions were killed across the globe in events that we rightly remember to this day. However, the pain of the era did not end there. Between 1916 and 1930, an epidemic of encephalitis lethargica, sleeping sickness, or sleepy sickness, surged through the population. It's been largely forgotten, despite killing 500,000 people and incapacitating hundreds of thousands. It's even been accused of contributing to the outbreak of World War II and the rages of Adolf Hitler. If true, well, that death toll skyrockets. Konstantin von Economo, a neurologist in Vienna, was the first to report the disease in 1917. He named it after its primary symptoms: severe lethargy and drowsiness. Sleepy sickness might not sound like the most terrifying plague to befall mankind, but the reality for 2/3 of patients was deadly or life-altering. Victims experienced a wide variety of symptoms, which made it hard to diagnose at first. During the initial acute phase, they would endure fever, movement disorders, delirium, headaches, paralysis, involuntary eye movements, and extreme sleepiness. Their exhaustion was so severe that many could sleep for 18 hours a day and even fall into a coma-like state. Some who entered the chronic phase of the illness remained frozen like living statues for 40 years. If you've heard of sleeping sickness, you may know it from the 1973 book or the 1990s film Awakenings. These tell the story of Dr. Oliver Sacks, a neurologist working with post-encephalitic patients in America. He administered a new drug, levodopa, in an attempt to release the victims from their years of immobility. Remarkably, patients were successfully woken after their decades-long sleep. Tragically, not all had a happy ending. Some experienced violent mood swings, and one patient refused to accept that she was no longer in the 1920s, and she stopped responding to the treatment. Von Economo classified the acute phase of the illness into 3 separate forms. Firstly, the somnolent ophthalmoplegic form. This was the most common and, unfortunately, the most deadly version of the disease. Patients experiencing this suffer the extreme exhaustion for which the condition was named. Other symptoms include confusion, delirium, fever, meningeal irritation, and nerve weakness leading to abnormal eye movements. More than 50% of people with this form die. However, survivors are also the most likely to suffer from no long-term side effects. Secondly, there's the hypokinetic form. This variation of the disease is easily recognized by the wild and uncontrolled movements of the patients. The main symptom, chorea, is named from the Greek word for dance, choros. This is because the movements make sufferers appear as if they're dancing. Other symptoms include jerks, contractions of the jaw, oscillations of the eyes, pain in the face and limbs, hallucinations, and day-night sleep cycle reversal. The final form of sleepy sickness is the amiostatic akinetic form. It's the least common type, and it's notable due to the patient's complete lack of movement. While their bodies are immobile, though, their minds are fully functioning. Other symptoms include rigidity, weakness, and masked faces, where the muscles of the face just stop functioning normally. This prevents the patient from making facial expressions and showing emotions, just as if they were wearing a mask. 2/3 who survive the acute phase may initially think themselves lucky. However, this is an exceptionally cruel disease that leaves victims living under a shadow. They're left waiting for the axe to fall, as years or even decades after the initial illness, patients can, sometimes quite suddenly, enter the chronic phase. This brings a range of new symptoms that affect bodies and minds. Those who knew the patients in the original epidemic said that they were changed from the person they once were. That person would simply never come back. Post-encephalitic Parkinsonism is the most common symptom of the chronic phase. It leads to extreme stiffness in the upper body. Patients are often rendered completely unable to move their arms. Interestingly, from a neurological point of view, this can often be overcome with an external stimulus, such as a ball. A patient can be wheelchair-bound and unable to move or feed themselves, but when a ball is thrown to them, they can suddenly catch it and return it without a problem. Another common effect of the chronic phase is the involuntary movement of the eyes. Patients can enter an ocular gyric crisis in which their eyes roll upwards. This can last for a few seconds or many hours and occurs in up to 30% of patients. They remain fully conscious throughout the event, but are completely unable to control their own eye movements. The final and most distressing impacts of this disease are the psychiatric disorders. Some might be lucky enough to experience euphoria, and mildly damaging social disorders like silliness or excessive puns Yes, really. The unlucky ones, though, might demonstrate obsessive thoughts, impulsiveness, violence, and cruelty to others. Many survivors from the 1920s found themselves committing a series of crimes such as theft and prostitution. Another point of interest is that the impulsive behavior is rarely for the patient's own gain. For example, they might steal things they don't want or need and simply forget about the items or give them away. When questioned, past patients would simply say that they were compelled to take the item. Many patients also experience extreme apathy towards life. They lose the ability to find pleasure in anything. Some have actually reported the apathy as a blessing because it's prevented them from becoming depressed about their situation. Other symptoms can be even more severe, and reports from the 1920s are harrowing. Psychosis affects 30% of patients, which can lead to violent outbursts, manic episodes, and self-mutilation. In one case, an 8-year-old girl removed all her teeth and both of her eyes. When it became clear that patients had entered the chronic and degenerative phase of the illness, they were told there was no cure. Many began freezing up, their bodies losing the ability to move over months or years. Many became unable to talk or even change their facial expression. In one case, a woman could no longer swallow solid food. However, patients retained their intelligence, and they were fully aware of their surroundings despite being unable to interact with them. Sufferers were sent to live out the rest of their lives in chronic disease hospitals. They would slowly become less mobile and rely on carers for their every need. In the 1960s, a new drug, levodopa, was developed for use with Parkinson's patients. One of the sleepy sickness sufferers was actually one of the first to hear about the new drug, dopamine, and its potential. He nicknamed it resuscitamine, with the hope that it could bring him and his fellow sufferers back to life. In the summer of 1969, Dr. Sachs administered the drug to a group of near-catatonic patients, and the effects were instantaneous. Many rose from their wheelchairs and walked, sang, or even danced. Initially, staff and patients were elated, believing that their prayers had been answered and a cure had finally been found. Unfortunately, despite the initially miraculous results, this was not the cure. The dopamine did return the patient's ability to move, but it did not mend the structural damage to the brain or remake the neural connections which had been lost. Some became manic, violent, and angry. Others remained unable to control their movements and were left to endure extreme tremors or head rolling. During the 1920s, more than 9,000 scholarly articles were published on the subject, but none could convincingly identify the cause. Scientists not only had no idea how to treat it, they also had no clue what caused it. A sickness was spreading like wildfire, turning people into motionless zombies, and they didn't know if it was being transmitted by sneezing, petting stray dogs, or eating overripe bananas. There were many theories. Some thought that the fact that the epidemic occurred at the same time as the Spanish flu pandemic was too much of a coincidence. They proposed the link between the two. Others pointed to bacteria, viruses, autoimmune response, and toxins as potential culprits. And to be completely honest with you, we're still not 100% sure. Virologist Professor John Oxford felt that leaving a previous epidemic unsolved was a recipe for disaster. And we've got to agree. When the cases plummeted, the world essentially said, wow, that was horrible. Should we figure out how to stop it in case it comes back? And the response seemed to be, well, no, let's not bother. And it's not even like it completely disappeared. Sporadic cases are still appearing, and we have no cure. Then, when a 23-year-old was diagnosed in 1993, Professor Oxford decided to act. He located brain tissue samples from the original patients of the 1920s and began looking for traces of a virus. He believed that the Spanish flu could be responsible, but he found no trace of any virus in the tissue. As more patients started appearing, it caught the attention of Dr. Russell Dale at Great Ormond Street Hospital. He began tracking down as many cases as he could until he had 20 patients in total. He worked together with Dr. Andrew Church, trying to find a link connecting all the victims. They had a breakthrough. They discovered that every one of the patients had suffered a sore throat before their encephalitis lethargica symptoms appeared. This kicked off the hunt for evidence of bacterial infection, and they found it. A rare form of Streptococcus bacteria was present in all of their patients. That's right, a variant of the very common bacteria normally responsible for a simple sore throat. The theory is that some people experience an extreme immune response to the Streptococcus bacteria, an immune response so severe that their bodies start attacking themselves. So, did they manage to crack one of the biggest medical mysteries looming over humanity? Well, many believe so. However, their theory leaves many questions unanswered, like why did so many experience this immune reaction all at once? Why did the epidemic end so suddenly? And why hasn't it occurred again? You might guess that it has something to do with sleeping. However, it's not the exhaustion that kills you. The disease attacks the brain, causing inflammation and bleeding. Sometimes the damage is so extensive it leads to respiratory failure. That's the cause of the 33% death rate. Autopsies have revealed discrete lesions in the midbrain, particularly damage to the oculomotor nucleus, explaining the eye movement disorders that many suffer with. Damage can also be seen in the substantia nigra, accounting for the movement and behavioral symptoms. It's well known that Adolf Hitler had symptoms of Parkinson's disease. Reports date back to 1934 when he was 45 years old. However, some sources indicate that he may have had transient symptoms starting in 1923 at the age of 34. This would be classed as young-onset Parkinsonism, and it would align with the 1920s epidemic of encephalitis lethargica. His most well-known symptom was a tremor in his left hand. He often kept it in his pocket or held a cane to steady it. He wanted to hide it so he would not be seen as senile or suffering from alcoholism. By 1942, he had reduced his public appearances and would only allow himself to be photographed at angles that didn't reveal it. By 1945, witnesses described him as shriveling up like an old man. He stooped and his entire left arm was severely affected. He was only 56. Prime Minister of France, Daladier, also witnessed an ocular gyrate crisis in 1938. He reported that Hitler's eyes turned suddenly upwards, and other instances have also been caught on film. The transient nature of his symptoms, his involuntary upward eye movements, and his left side tremor lead the diagnosis towards post-encephalitic Parkinson's, as does the timeline. 50% of diagnoses of Parkinsonism in his age group at the time were encephalitic. The jury is still out on the cause of Hitler's Parkinsonism. Was it idiopathic, spontaneous, and cause unknown, or was it post-encephalitic, a symptom of chronic encephalitis lethargica? His hatred for others was also established before 1918, so the illness could not be held responsible for his horrific acts. But could it go some way to explain his lies, uncontrolled rages, obsessions, and lack of remorse? Some think so. Frustratingly, only a portion of Hitler's jaw and skull remained to be examined, and so a full autopsy was never completed. It's therefore incredibly likely that we'll never know the cause of his Parkinsonism. The accusations made against encephalitis lethargica and its role in World War II do not end there, though. It's been suggested that US President Woodrow Wilson was another victim of the disease. Before the 1919 peace conference, it felt very strongly that any treaty made should not humiliate Germany. He believed that if the treaty was too harsh, there would be potential for resentment to build up and for peace to be broken. He began the peace conference arguing strongly against the French and the proposal of punitive reparations. However, he was struck down by sickness, becoming very ill. Though he recovered, those close to him reported a change in personality, lack of mental agility, and said that he would tire easily. There were also incidents of paranoia where he believed the French servants to be spies. Despite the worries of his staff, he continued the peace negotiations. He abandoned his original beliefs, yielded to the French demands, and the Treaty of Versailles was signed. This has led some people to ask the question, did encephalitis lethargica impact the conditions of the treaty, leading to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the start of World War II? It's a vicious and cruel disease that left wards of patients alive but frozen for the world to see. So why is it not in our history books, not taught in schools or referenced in relation to the current pandemic? Why has it been forgotten? Well, this is largely due to it being overshadowed by the far more deadly Spanish flu. The 1918 influenza outbreak spread worldwide and led to approximately 50 million deaths. 1/3 of the world's population was infected with the virus, so while sleeping sickness was incredibly deadly, the Spanish flu killed 100 times more people, and it affected essentially everyone. The second reason is its rapid disappearance. Almost as quickly as it began, the sleepy sickness disappeared. As there were no new patients, there became more pressing medical issues to focus on. Finally, it just left everyone baffled. Without an epidemic to get under control, it lost the attention of the medical community, and they turned their focus to problems that they could actually solve. Now, not to freak you out, but no, there's no cure. The incredibly common bacteria usually responsible for a scratchy throat has the potential to once again start spreading through the population, trapping people in their bodies. Things are not entirely hopeless though. If it's caused by bacteria, it's likely to respond to antibiotics, providing antibiotic resistance has not taken hold, that is. Another small ray of hope is that hypokinetic patients have shown a response to steroids in some small studies, potentially offering a new course of treatment for those left with involuntary movements and twitches. So, have we seen the last of the sleeping sickness. Well, the good news is that the disease largely disappeared in the 1940s. The bad news is that 80 cases have been reported since then. However, due to the vast array of symptoms and lack of definitive diagnosis, it's likely that some of these were not encephalitis lethargica. How these few cases have appeared in isolation instead of part of an outbreak is just not known. The sudden appearance and consequent disappearance remains one of the greatest medical mysteries to date. Therefore, no, we can't rule out another epidemic. However, we are much better equipped to deal with it than we were in the 1920s, so I'm going to keep it fairly low on my list of things to keep me awake at night.